There are two kinds of silence on a frontier farm. There's the silence of a man working alone in a field. A man can live inside that one for 40 years and never feel lonely. And there's the silence of two men standing 8 feet apart in a yard, both knowing exactly what's about to be said, and neither willing to say it first. That kind has weight. You can feel it pressed down on a house. That was the silence in the Hartley yard on the last morning of April, when a preacher who had never in 30 years asked anybody for anything came up that road with his daughter beside him, climbed down, and took his hat off before he'd reached the porch steps. A man doesn't take his hat off in his own defense. He takes it off when he's come to ask, and what Reverend Sinclair had come to ask that morning was the kind of thing a man carries to his grave, whether it turns out well or badly. Remember that, because by the end of this story, you'll understand something about that morning that not one of the 4 people standing in that yard understood at the time. Not the preacher, not the girl behind him with her hands laced too tight in front of her skirt, and least of all the man on the porch steps, who had already made up his mind 3 days earlier and had told nobody what it cost him. The wind came down off the fields, still dark with new-turned soil, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Anybody whose farm knows that smell. It's the smell of a promise the sky hasn't decided whether it means to keep. Reverend Sinclair stood in the yard, hat in hand, his daughter a half-step behind him. Henry Hartley waited on the porch steps, Ruth's kitchen towel still slung over his shoulder from breakfast. He'd noticed it halfway across the front room, and decided that stopping to fold it would look like a man arranging himself. "Have you thought this through?" the Reverend asked. No greeting first. He hadn't come for one. Henry didn't answer right away. His eyes moved past the older man to Grace, and something in his face, not quite doubt, not quite resolve, seemed to ask her the same question before he asked himself. That look lasted maybe 2 seconds. Grace thought about it the rest of her life, because in those 2 seconds, she understood that this man, whoever else he was, had just checked with her, not with her father, not with the arrangement, with her, and nobody had checked with her about anything since the day she stepped off the train from Bismarck, with her coat buttoned to the throat in a warm parlor, and watched her father's eyes travel down her body, and understand. Her gaze dropped the moment his met hers. Her hands found each other in front of her skirt, knuckles going pale. A flush climbed her neck. When she looked up again, her eyes were bright and wet, though she didn't let them spill, because she had promised herself in the buggy that she would not cry in this yard, and she meant to keep at least that much of herself in her own hands. "I accept," Henry said, 2 words, flat as a fence rail, and the Reverend studied him a moment longer, as if 2 words weren't proof enough, because he had come out here to spend his daughter's whole future on them. "I don't ask you to love her," the Reverend said, "only that you never treat her poorly." "I won't," Henry said. "Not now, not later." Nothing more passed between the 2 men. The Reverend nodded once, settled his hat back on his head, and walked to his buggy without looking back at his daughter. Not once. He turned the horse in the yard, and Henry, who read men's bodies the way farmers read weather, saw that his shoulders did not sit quite as straight as they had coming in. That's what it looks like from outside when a father hands over the one thing he's always been afraid of getting wrong. It looks like a man's shoulders coming down an inch. Grace didn't watch him go. She kept her eyes on the porch rail and counted boards until the sound of the wheels belonged to the road instead of to her. Henry didn't hurry her. He waited until she turned around on her own. "They'll be in the barn," he said. "Ruth'll have heard the buggy." Ruth was already there, wiping her hands on her apron, which was Ruth's way of arriving anywhere. She never came into a room. She came into it finishing something. Silas stood with his arms folded and his jaw set. Jonah grinned like a boy who'd been told there'd be a party and hadn't yet learned to hide it. "This is Grace," Henry said. Nothing more, no explanation, no story. He'd told them the night before, plainly, standing in his own kitchen with his hat in his hands, like a stranger, what the arrangement was, what it wasn't. That a child was coming that wasn't his, and that anyone who couldn't stomach it should say so to his face that night, rather than let it curdle over the summer. Nobody said anything. Ruth went back to the dishes. Silas went out to the barn. Jonah asked whether that meant there'd be a wedding cake, and Ruth threw a dish rag at his head. So when Henry said "this is Grace," those 3 weren't learning anything. They were deciding, right there in the doorway, what to do with what they already knew. Ruth stepped forward first. She took Grace's hand in both of hers. Both, not one. That's a distinction a woman feels immediately, because one hand is a greeting, and 2 hands is a decision. Ruth's palms were stove-hot and rough as a saddle skirt, and she held on a second longer than politeness asked for. "You'll be hungry," Ruth said. "Nobody eats before a thing like this." Come on. Silas gave a short nod and said nothing at all. Jonah opened his mouth and shut it again at a look from Silas, which was, in that household, a kind of grammar. Later, inside, with the door closed between them and the yard, Henry spoke to her alone for the first time. Neither of them said, "This isn't a real marriage," he said. "Not by the way people mean it." He let that sit so she'd know he wouldn't dress anything up for her. "But it doesn't have to be an ugly one, either." And then he said the thing Grace would later name as the moment she stopped being afraid of him. "In this house, anything that concerns only you, your day, your time, your say in things, that's yours to decide. I won't ask you to answer to me for it." He paused. "You didn't have a choice in this." "I did, though it wasn't much of one, either, so the least I can give you is that." She nodded. She still hadn't found her voice. When it came, it was barely above the wind outside. And if she stopped, one hand moved without her noticing and came to rest against her middle. "When it comes, and after," she made herself look at him. "I know it isn't yours." The room went very quiet. "I only ask that you don't look at it unkindly. Whatever else happens between us, please don't let that be its fault." She wasn't asking him to love the child. She'd already crossed love off her list. She was asking for something smaller and far more important, that a person who had done nothing to anybody would not spend its whole childhood paying for it. She was asking him not to make a baby carry a grudge. Henry was quiet long enough that she looked down again, bracing for something she didn't want to hear. "I can't promise I'll love it as my own," he said finally. "I don't know yet if I will." Her jaw tightened. She'd expected that. Expecting a thing doesn't stop it landing. "But I can promise I'll treat it well. That much I can give you now, and it won't change later." That wasn't the answer of a man making a vow. It was the answer of a man who did not make promises he wasn't certain he could keep, which, though Grace didn't know it yet, was the truest thing about him. And it's exactly why, 8 months later, on a January night, the thing he hadn't promised would end up meaning more than anything he had. At the door he stopped. "You're carrying a child. Do only what's light. Ruth will see to the rest. Anything you need, ask her." A pause, something almost like the start of a smile, gone before it finished. Silas is a stubborn old man, plain-spoken to a fault, but there's no unkindness in him. Whatever his face says, don't let his words sit heavy with you. Then he was gone, out toward fields already dark with the season's first planting. A marriage begun like the wheat, in ground neither of them had chosen, with no way yet to know what either one would grow into. So why would a respected minister, a man who'd spent 30 years telling other people how to live, push his own daughter into a marriage with no love anywhere in it? And why would a man who still had every right to refuse, who owed that preacher nothing, say yes instead? Here's what I'll tell you now. Both of them gave a reason out loud that morning, and both of them kept a second reason behind their teeth. One of those two men wouldn't admit his real one for another 7 months. Sitting on that same porch, in the cold, with his breath showing, "Stay with me." Their story is only just getting started. And if frontier stories told slow, honest, and true are the kind you come back for, hit subscribe. There's a lot more waiting for you here on USA West Stories. The buggy jolted over a rut, and Reverend Sinclair reached out of habit to steady the person beside him before remembering the seat was empty. His hand stayed out there a moment, holding nothing. Then he put it back on the reins and looked straight ahead at a road he'd driven so often he no longer needed to watch it. 3 weeks earlier, Grace had come home from her aunt's in Bismarck sooner than expected. She'd stood in the parlor doorway with her coat still buttoned, though the room was warm, and she hadn't put down her bag. He looked at her face first, pallid, drawn, older, somehow that particular kind of older that has nothing to do with years, and only after a long moment did his eyes drop and understand. What he finally said was, "Does your mother know?" He would regret that sentence the rest of his life, not because it was cruel, because it was administrative. In the first moment his daughter needed him to be her father. He reached for the logistics of the thing. Grace shook her head, and then, quietly, with no accusation in it at all, which made it worse, she said, "I'll go back to Bismarck if it's easier." That's when he crossed the room. There had been letters, 3 of them, to a surveyor out of the territorial office, a young man with good manners and a good coat, who'd spent one long summer in their town and had been, by every account, entirely charming. The last letter was longer than the first 2 together. None of them were answered. By then, word had already begun moving through town the way it always does. Not loudly, never loudly, just a pause before her name in conversation, a look held half a second too long after church. Mrs. Dunmore asking, with enormous kindness whether Grace had enjoyed Bismarck, and asking again the following Sunday in the exact same tone, as if the answer hadn't taken. That's how it starts in a small town. Not with a shout, with a pause. He told himself, driving out to Henry Hartley's that first time, that he was doing this for her. A husband, a name for the child, a door that would close behind her before the town finished deciding what to say about her. All of that was true. It was also true, and he never said this part aloud to anyone. Not to his wife, not to his God, in words he'd have been willing to write down, that a scandal in his own household would not stay in his household. He built 30 years of trust in that town, one Sunday at a time, one funeral at a time, one sick room at a time, and he was not prepared to watch it come apart over something he could still, if he moved fast enough, keep anyone from ever needing to whisper about. He did not know, driving home with the seat beside him empty, which of those two reasons had carried more weight in the end. He suspected he never would. A man doesn't get to sort his own motives into clean piles. He only gets to look at what he did and then live in the house it built. 3 days before that morning, he'd driven the same road the other direction, alone, rehearsing sentences and discarding them. He found Henry at the barn mending a bridle, and for a while they talked of small things. The price of grain, a fence Henry meant to move before summer. Then Sinclair let the silence stretch, turning his hat once in his hands. I need something from you, Henry. Henry set the bridle down. Bank trouble. I could speak to Halloran, if no. Sinclair looked at him directly, because he'd decided somewhere on that road that he would not ask this while staring at the ground. I need you to marry my daughter. Henry went still in the particular way of a man certain he's misheard. Sinclair didn't make him ask twice. Grace was carrying a child. The father was gone, and would not be coming back. There was no path forward for her in that town without a husband's name beside her own. He didn't dress it up. He didn't pretend it was a small thing to ask. I've thought of no one else, he said. That's not flattery. It's the only thing I've got to offer you that costs me anything. And then he told him why. He'd watched Henry for 2 years, since Henry's own father passed, watched him go on paying Ruth and Silas and the boy through a lean season, when a sensible man would have let one of them go and called it arithmetic. Watched him settle every account on Merchant Row before the due date, though anyone with eyes could see it cost him sleep. Like a man who meant what he said. If I have to hand my daughter's name to somebody, Sinclair said, there's no one in this county I'd trust with it more. Then he laid out what he could offer. Enough money to see the farm through, however Henry judged best to use it. No conditions, no accounting owed, and he laid out, without being asked, the shape of an understanding beyond the marriage itself. Henry would not be made to love a wife he hadn't chosen. Grace would not be made to answer to a husband who held her circumstances over her. Separate rooms, until and unless she said otherwise. No hand laid on her without her word first. And after 3 years, if she wished to go, Henry would not stand in her way. None of it went on paper. Sinclair didn't offer a contract, and Henry didn't ask for one. You have my word, Sinclair said. Then you have mine. Henry answered, but he did not say yes. Not yet. He asked for time to think, and Sinclair, who hadn't expected an answer on the spot, gave it to him, drove home, and said nothing to his wife for 2 hours. He told Grace that evening at the kitchen table, long after her mother had gone up. He watched her face carefully as he spoke. Not for permission, he told himself, though that wasn't entirely true either. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She listened to the whole of it, including the parts about separate rooms and 3 years, which he made himself say out loud, because she had a right to know the exact dimensions of the room she was being put in. Then, she asked one thing first, and it wasn't about herself. Does he owe you anything? Nah, then he'll be doing it for the money. He'll be doing it for the people under his roof. Her father said, the money's how. It isn't why. She turned that over. She was her father's daughter. She could hear the difference between a reason and a mechanism. If he agreed, she finally said, I'll do it. It was not gratitude. It was not relief. It was the sound of a woman choosing the least impossible of several impossible things. And Sinclair, driving home, 3 days later, with her seat beside him empty, understood that he had asked her to make that choice, and that she'd made it because he had left her very little room to make another. Henry didn't go back into the house after Sinclair rode off that first day. He went to the small room off the kitchen that served as an office, where the farm's ledger sat open from that morning's accounting, and looked at the numbers as though they might have changed since he last read them. They hadn't. Numbers are the only honest thing in a hard year. They don't take your side and they don't apologize. The note at the bank still wanted more than this year's crop. Even a good one was likely to bring. Silas had said nothing about it in weeks, which was its own kind of saying something. Jonah still didn't know how close it stood. That had been deliberate. Ruth probably did. Ruth generally did. She'd never once let on she was worried, which was exactly the thing that told Henry he was thinking about Silas. 61 years old, nowhere else to go, no family of his own left living. A man who'd come to that place when Henry's father was still breaking sod on the south quarter. About Ruth, who'd run that kitchen since before Henry was tall enough to reach the table. And about Jonah, 13 when Henry took him, and 19 now, who in 6 years had never once asked what would happen to him if the farm went under, because some part of a boy who's already lost one home doesn't let himself wonder about losing a second. He just gets up early and works hard and hopes that's the price. That was the ledger Henry was actually reading, not the one on the desk. He closed the book. He didn't need 3 days to decide, though he let Sinclair believe it took thought. The thinking had mostly been done already, in 100 small reckonings over the past year, each one adding up toward this exact kind of morning, without his quite noticing until it arrived. And so, on the last morning of April, with the fields behind him, only just turned for planting, Henry Hartley stood on his own porch steps and heard a man he respected ask a question he had already answered 3 days before. "Have you thought this through?" He had. The Reverend came back that same afternoon. The legal ceremony took less than 10 minutes. Ruth and Silas stood witness in the front room. Jonah hovered by the door with his hat in his hands, because he didn't know where else to put them, and it seemed wrong to wear it indoors, and worse, to set it down. No flowers, no supper after, nothing about it Grace would later call a wedding, except the license and the new name written across the bottom of it when it was done. Her father performed it. Sit with that a moment. He stood in another man's front room and read the words he'd read over 100 couples in that county. Honor and cherish, and as long as you both shall live. To his own daughter and a man she had spoken to twice, his voice held steady the whole way, because 30 years of practice will hold a voice up when nothing else is holding. It broke exactly once. On the word daughter, nobody mentioned it. Ruth looked at the floor. Silas looked out the window. Jonah, 19, and not yet fluent in the ways grown men come apart, looked right at the Reverend, and then had to look away fast. When it was over, nobody knew what came next, because in a real wedding, what comes next is joy, and there wasn't any scheduled. It was Ruth who ended it. "There's a pea," she said, to nobody in particular. "It's not a wedding pea, it's just a pea, but it's cooling on the sill, and it isn't going to eat itself." So the first meal of that marriage was a pie Ruth Ellery had baked at 11 that morning, without telling a soul, on the reasoning that a girl walking into a strange house ought to find something sweet in it on her first day. Whatever else the day was, Grace ate a piece. She didn't taste it, but 40 years later she could still tell you it was dried apple with too much cinnamon, which is how you know she did. The first loaf Grace tried to bake came out of Ruth's oven, black on the bottom and raw enough in the middle to still be dough. She stood over it a long moment, waiting for Ruth to say something, waiting, if we're honest, to be told she was useless, because she'd spent 3 weeks expecting the world to finally say out loud what she assumed it thought. Ruth only took the pan from her hands, scraped the worst of it into the hog bucket, and said, "Fire runs hotter on the left side of that oven. Nobody tells you that till they've burned something." And she set a second bowl of dough in front of Grace before the first was even in the bucket. The second loaf was better, not good, better. It went that way through most of May, Grace learning the things a farm wife was supposed to already know, one small failure at a time, with Ruth standing close enough to catch her before it became a disaster and far enough back to let her feel every mistake as her own. She scorched a pot of beans, she hung wash in weather that turned to rain within the hour and had to bring it in soaked, and stood dripping in the kitchen, while Jonah laughed so hard he had to hold the doorframe, and Ruth threatened his life, and Grace, to her own astonishment, laughed too. First time since Bismarck. Silas was a different matter. He said almost nothing to her that first month beyond what the work required, and what little he said came clipped, with no warmth behind it. Grace understood why. He was one of 3 people who knew the whole of her circumstances, not the polite version the town would eventually settle on, but the truth, and a man who'd spent 30 years on that land, and watched it come within a season of going under for reasons that had nothing to do with her, had earned the right to be slow about trusting the woman who walked into it. She didn't ask him to be otherwise. She kept doing her share of the work in front of him and let him decide on his own time what to make of that. There was one evening she never told anybody about. She'd gone up early, the house was quiet, and through the floorboards she heard Silas say to Ruth, low, in a voice not meant to travel, "It's not the girl I'm sour on." "I know it," Ruth said. "It's that he's paying for somebody else's wrong with the only thing he's got left." And Ruth said, "Then you'd better hope she's worth it, hadn't you?" and set a cup down hard enough to end the conversation. Grace lay in the dark a long time after that. What stayed with her wasn't the sting, it was the word paying, because all spring she'd been thinking of herself as a woman who had been rescued. She had not once thought about what the rescue cost the man who did it. That was the night she stopped waiting to be forgiven and started looking for something she could actually do. It was the ledger that gave her the first real foothold. She found it by accident, going through the desk for a pen, and once she'd opened it, she couldn't quite make herself close it again. The columns were a mess, figures crossed out and rewritten in the margins, receipts tucked loose between the pages instead of entered. 2 whole months where somebody, Henry, plainly, at the end of a 16-hour day, had simply written misc and a number. She sat down and, without asking anyone, began sorting it into something that made sense. Henry found her there 2 evenings later, the desk covered in reorganized figures, 3 lamps worth of light burned through. "That's been needing doing for a year. I didn't ask first. I noticed." He almost smiled. "Keep going." He never thanked her outright, not in words, but she began noticing things, an extra armful of firewood by her door, before she'd thought to ask for it. A loose board in her floor fixed without comment. The day after she'd mentioned in passing that it creaked. Ruth mentioned once, offhand, that Henry had told her to keep Grace off the well pump. The bucket was too heavy for a woman carrying a child. And that was the end of the discussion as far as he was concerned. Ruth noticed the noticing. She said nothing either, but Grace caught her once setting 2 cups instead of 3 on a morning Jonah had gone into town, leaving her and Henry to share the coffee pot in a silence that wasn't quite as empty as it should have been. It happened again the next week, with the mending. Ruth's hands were somehow too full with the wash to take up Henry's torn shirt, so it fell somehow to Grace, who sat across from him, working the needle, while he oiled a bridle, neither of them talking much. Both of them had either thought to notice, entirely comfortable in it. Jonah, for his part, treated Grace as though she'd always been there, teasing Silas without mercy, hiding his hate, whistling old ballads off-key, just to watch the old man's jaw tighten, and folding Grace into it as easily as if she were a cousin who'd been away a while. He asked her nothing about the child. It plainly never occurred to him there was anything to ask, which, of all the kindnesses shown to Grace that summer, may have been the largest, and it was the only one nobody had to decide to give. Late one evening, coming back from the horses, she passed the barn and saw a light still burning inside. Henry was at the far bench, planing a length of pine into curved slats, sawdust pale against his boots. She didn't ask what it was for. She had a fair guess, and something about the quiet, careful way he worked told her this wasn't a thing he meant to be asked about yet. She went on to the house without a word. She didn't sleep for some time. By the end of June, Silas had stopped going quiet when she came into the barn. He didn't warm to her, exactly. That wasn't in him yet. But one afternoon, watching her frown over a column of figures that didn't match what the grain bins actually held, he set down his pitchfork long enough to say, without looking at her, "You're counting bushels like they're dollars. They're not the same animal." And then, grudgingly, he told her why. It was the first full sentence he'd offered her that wasn't an order or a correction. Grace wrote down every word of it in the margin of the ledger, and did not let herself make anything of it beyond what it was, which is what people do after they've been disappointed badly enough once. They refuse to count a good sign until it's been counted twice. The hail came at night, at the end of July, with no warning, beyond a wind that turned strange, and a sky that went the color of a bruise an hour before dark. Grace stood at the window and watched it hammer the yard white for 11 minutes by the kitchen clock. When Henry moved toward the door partway through, Ruth put a flat hand on his chest. "There's nothing out there to save while it's still falling." He stopped because she was right, and because arguing with Ruth had never once gone well for anyone in that house. They went out at first light instead. The damage wasn't everywhere. Hail rarely falls even, but where it struck, the wheat lay flattened and broken-stalked in wide, ragged patches, heads knocked loose into the mud. Henry walked the rows with his jaw tight and said very little. Silas knelt in one of the worst patches, tested a stock between his fingers, and said even less. Jonah paced off the ruined ground to get a figure on the acreage, and when he came back and said the number out loud, nobody answered him, and the boy stood there, holding it like something he wished he hadn't brought. They didn't try to save all of it. Silas made that call within the hour, cut what could still be salvaged before the next rain worsened it, and let the worst sections go. There's no arguing that kind of arithmetic once it's been said out loud. Grace didn't go out among the broken stalks. She carried water and cold biscuits to the men working past noon, and kept a running count of which wagon came in from which section, so the sound grain wouldn't get mixed with the damage. And she sat that evening at the kitchen table refiguring by lamplight what the lost acreage meant against what they still owed. The number was not a good one. She showed it to him anyway, exactly as it stood, because she'd decided something about herself that summer. Whatever else she was, in that house, she would not be one more person managing Henry Hartley's feelings for him. He looked at the figure a long time. "That's honest work," he said. "Thank you for not rounding it." Harvest came 3 weeks later, and with it, a second blow that had nothing to do with hail. The price of wheat had fallen hard from the season before, down to less than 2/3 of what Henry had counted on when he borrowed to expand the acreage. Back when the numbers looked like they'd hold, they didn't hold, and when he hauled the first wagon load to the grain buyer in town, the man waited, ran a hand through a sample, and graded it lower than Henry believed it deserved. Low enough that, with the fallen price, it wouldn't come close to covering what the bank wanted by autumn. Henry said nothing beyond a short nod, took his receipt, drove home with his jaw set in a way Grace had learned by then to recognize. He didn't come into supper. Ruth put a plate in the warming oven, and left it. At 10 o'clock, it was still there. At 11, it was gone, and the plate was washed and back on the shelf, and nobody in that house ever mentioned it. Here's where the story turns, not on a rescue, not on money arriving from anywhere, on a woman with a peen. 3 evenings later, Grace sat hunched over that ledger with Silas's grain figures open beside her father's old letters about the Minneapolis Exchange. From years when he'd corresponded with merchants there, over the church's own small dealings, the grading system, she realized, wasn't one man's opinion. There were standards behind it, set down years before, standards that decided what separated a fair grade from a low one. If their wheat truly graded as high as Silas insisted, and Silas had never in his life overpraised anything, including his own work, then sold to a buyer who applied those standards honestly, rather than to one local agent's judgment, the difference would be enough not to clear the note, but enough to bring the bank a payment large enough to justify an extension instead of a foreclosure. She sat back at 2 in the morning with her hand pressed to her side, where the child had started moving whenever she stayed up late, as though it kept her hours. Then she went and knocked on Henry's door. "We don't need my father to pay the debt," she told him, the ledger open between them, the two of them standing in a hallway in the middle of the night. "We need someone else to look at the wheat," she wrote to her father that night, not asking for money, only for a name. He wrote back within the week with one, a grain merchant in the next county who'd done business with the church for years and owed Reverend Sinclair nothing but the kind of goodwill a man doesn't forget. The merchant came out, took his own sample, and confirmed within minutes what Grace had already worked out on paper. The grade was better than the local buyer had given it, by enough to matter, and it was Silas who made the difference sharper still. Back in June, Grace had suggested they hold the best of the crop separate at harvest, rather than committing all of it to the first buyer. He'd waved it off at the time without a word of agreement. He had not ignored it. Once the wheat came in, he'd quietly binned the best lot apart on his own, and kept it back from that first wagon load. Told nobody, not even Henry. That grain, graded properly now, alongside the rest, closed most of the remaining gap. Henry took the competing offer to the bank himself, swallowing more pride in that one conversation than in the whole of the past year, and came home with an extension instead of a foreclosure notice. Silas found her in the kitchen the evening the bank's letter came, going back through the ledger to make the final figures balance. He stood in the doorway looking at the columns over her shoulder, and said nothing for long enough that she nearly asked if something was wrong. Then he smiled, the first time she'd ever seen it happen, a small, startled thing on a face that didn't seem built for it. That was a good call. Mrs. Hartley. It was the first time he'd said her married name, without the distance he'd always put behind it, and he was back out to the barn before she could think of anything to say in return, which was, she suspected, exactly how he wanted it. What she didn't know, and wouldn't know for another 2 years, was that Silas Rourke had once had a daughter of his own. that she'd have been about Grace's age, and that she and her mother were both buried in Iowa under a name he never said out loud. That's what the month of silence had actually been. It had never once been about her. September passed, quieter than any month before it. The bank had granted its extension. The worst of the crop was in, and for the first time since the wedding there was nothing pressing enough to keep either of them from noticing how the days had started arranging themselves. Henry finding reasons to be in from the fields before dark instead of after. Grace no longer waiting for an invitation to sit with him and Silas on the porch in the evening. Neither of them said anything about it. There didn't seem to be a need to. Her time came in the second week of October, in the middle of the night, with a suddenness that had Jonah saddling a horse for the midwife before Ruth finished pulling on her boots. Ruth went in with the midwife and did not come back out. Henry stood in the kitchen, then the hallway, then the kitchen again, doing nothing useful with his hands, because there was nothing useful to do with them. Silas found small tasks to occupy himself, a harness that didn't need mending, a lamp that didn't need trimming. He made a point of walking past the hallway door every few minutes on his way to nowhere in particular. Jonah wore an actual path in the floorboards until Silas set down the harness and said, without much patience left, "Boy, you're wearing a trench in that floor. Sit down or go outside. One or the other." Jonah sat for about 4 minutes. It went on past midnight into the small hours, long enough that Henry stopped pretending he wasn't listening for every sound through the door. At one point he found himself standing with his hand flat on the wall beside it, and took it down again quickly. Silas never once said a word about it. Then, or after, when the crying finally came, furious, entirely alive, Henry was on his feet before he'd decided to stand. Ruth opened the door herself, her face tired and pleased in equal measure. "A girl," she said. "Come see her." He went in slowly, the way a man walks into a room he isn't sure he's allowed in. Grace looked up at him from the bed, pallet worn through, smiling despite it, the baby wrapped and small against her arm. And then Grace did the thing that decided the rest of both their lives. She did it without a word, and it took about 2 seconds. She held the baby out to him. She didn't have to. No arrangement required it. Nothing on paper. There had never been anything on paper. Gave the man who married her in April any claim at all on what was in her arms in October. She held her daughter out to a man she'd known 6 months, and in doing it, she said the only sentence that mattered. "This can be yours, if you want her." Henry took her the way a man takes something he's afraid of dropping, stiff-armed at first, until the weight settled, and something in him settled with it. He looked at the baby a long time. Nobody asked what he was thinking. It would have been hard to answer even if they had. "She's got your stubborn chin," Grace said finally, quiet, watching him. "She's got nothing of mine." He didn't look up from the baby's face. "Not yet. Give her time." It wasn't quite a joke. Grace understood it anyway. Understood, watching him stand there with a child that carried none of his blood, held like something he'd already decided to keep, that whatever answer he'd been working toward all these months had arrived somewhere in that room without either of them needing to say it out loud. "Henry," he looked up. She didn't finish whatever she'd meant to say. It didn't seem, in that moment, like it needed finishing. He crossed the room, sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and for a while, the three of them stayed like that. Grace and Henry, and the baby between them. While out in the kitchen, Ruth put the coffee on for a household that wasn't going to sleep again that night, and Silas allowed himself alone in the hallway, where nobody could see it, something close to a smile. A few days later, once Grace was steady enough to be up about the house, she found Henry in the barn, still working at the cradle that hardly needed any more work, sanding an edge that was already smooth, the way a man occupies his hands when he doesn't know what to do with the rest of himself. "I meant what I told you in April," he said, not looking up. "If you ever want to leave, I won't stand in your way. Are you asking me to?" He set the sandpaper down. "Nah, then don't say it to me like I'm already halfway out the door." Henry Hartley. He looked at her properly then, the way he hadn't quite let himself since the morning she married him. "Stay," he said. "Not because of any arrangement, because I'm asking." "I will," she said. "I'd already meant to." Neither of them said anything grander. It didn't seem to need it. And if you're waiting for the part where he tells her he loves her, he doesn't. Not that day, not that month. He said it to somebody else first. And it was the last person on earth either of them would have expected. Reverend and Mrs. Sinclair came out 3 weeks later, when Grace was steady on her feet, and the baby old enough to be handed around a parlor, without anyone holding their breath. Mrs. Sinclair cried the moment the child was in her arms, unashamed about it, and spent most of the visit refusing to give her up to anyone but Grace. The Reverend was quieter. He held his granddaughter longer than he likely meant to, and watched more than he spoke. And what he watched, over 2 days, was Henry. He watched him carry the washtub out to the yard himself, rather than let Grace lift it. Though she'd told him twice she was strong enough, he watched him ask Ruth, low, in a voice he probably thought nobody else caught, whether Grace had managed to eat anything that morning. He watched him get up in the night. The Reverend heard it through the thin wall of the guest room. Footsteps and a low tuneless hum. Nothing that could rightly be called singing. And Henry didn't come back to bed until the crying stopped, so that great, worn thin, could sleep through it. None of it was said aloud. None of it needed to be. Not to a man who'd spent 30 years learning to read what people do instead of what they say. On the second evening, after supper, the Reverend asked Henry to sit with him on the porch. The same porch 7 months later, the night cold enough that their breath showed. For a while neither of them spoke, watching the dark settle over land that would be under snow within a month. I was selfish the day I came to your, the Reverend said finally. I want you to know I understood that then, even if I didn't say it. Henry didn't answer directly. He didn't seem to think it needed answering. I've watched you 2 days now, the Reverend went on. A man can put on a good show of duty for 2 days if he has to. I don't think that's what I've been watching. He turned and looked at him. I need to ask you plainly, and I'd rather you take a moment than give me something quick. Then he said it. Do you love her? Not the arrangement. Henry was quiet long enough that the Reverend almost regretted asking so bluntly. Henry said finally, I didn't expect to. I'm not sure I'd have believed you back in April if you'd told me I would. The Reverend looked out at the fields a while. If the answer had been otherwise, he said, I wouldn't have pressed you to keep pretending. I'd have taken her and the child home myself. Once she was strong enough to travel, whatever people chose to say about it, I'd have borne that myself. I know. Henry kept his eyes on the dark fields. That's not what I want. Thought. I want us to stay what we've become, not what we started as. He paused. Something in his face shifted before the words came, awkward, in a way that suited him better than smoothness would have. Sir, Father, if you'll allow it. The Reverend didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice wasn't entirely steady. I'll allow it. They sat a while longer before Henry spoke again. Grace and I have talked about it. She never had a wedding, not the kind anyone would call one. We'd like a day that feels like ours, not to marry again. We're married already and that's not in question, but something of her own to remember. Once the ground's dry for the new crop this spring, and the baby's a little older, nothing grand, we'd be glad if you and Mrs. Sinclair would come. We'll come, the Reverend said, without needing to think about it. Try and stop us. Inside, through the parlor window, they could see Grace laughing at something Ruth had said, the baby asleep against her shoulder, Jonah pretending to fend off Silas's attempts to reclaim his own chair. The Reverend looked at it a long moment, the whole warm, ordinary shape of it, and thought, not for the first time since April, that he'd gotten far more right than he had any reason to expect from a decision he made mostly out of fear. He did not say that part aloud, either. Some things, he'd learned, are better left where they belong. Carrie, not spoken. Winter came down hard, and stayed. Snow buried the fields past the fence line by December, and the household drew in on itself the way it always did. Ruth by the stove with a baby against her shoulder more often than not. Jonah making increasingly foolish faces across the room just to hear her laugh. Silas grumbling every single time he stubbed his boot on the cradle that had somehow ended up parked in the middle of the front hallway, though he never once moved it out of his way himself. The baby did not sleep easily. Most nights she settled well enough. Some nights she didn't, and on those nights it was Henry, more often than not, who got up first. Grace woke once deep, in January, to an empty half of the bed and a faint sound from the front room. Not crying anymore, just a low, uneven hum, tuneless, the same one her father had mentioned overhearing back in November, without her understanding at the time what he meant. She got up and stood in the doorway a while without going in. Henry was walking slow half circles around the room, the baby's head tucked beneath his chin, one hand splayed wide across her back. And the cradle he'd built for her, planed and sanded, and fitted with more care than the man who built it would ever admit to, sat empty by the window, exactly where it always sat on nights like this. She wouldn't settle in it. She only settled against him. Now think all the way back, to a closed door in April, to a woman with her hand against her middle, asking a stranger for the smallest thing she could think to ask for. Please don't look at it unkindly. And a man who wouldn't lie to her, even to comfort her. I can't promise I'll love it as my own. I don't know yet if I will. He was right not to promise, because a promise is only words, and words were the cheapest thing either of them had that spring. This was the answer instead. A man who'd said he could offer nothing beyond decent treatment, walking the floor at 2 in the morning for a child that wasn't his by blood, and hadn't been not his for one single day since. He didn't see Grace in the doorway. She didn't let him know she was there. She only watched a while, the two of them turning slow circles in the dark. Then she went back to bed and let him have it a little longer before either of them said anything about it. Snow gave way to mud by late March, and mud gave way, by the last week of April, to ground dry enough to work. Henry walked the same fields he'd walked a year before, turning the same soil for the season's new crop, though little else about the walking felt the same. The ceremony came the last Sunday in May, once the wheat was in the ground, and the baby sturdy enough to be handed lap to lap through a whole afternoon without complaint. Grace wore a dress that had nothing practical about it, chosen for no reason beyond that she liked how it felt, and she stood with Henry in the yard, the same yard, while her father, not as a minister settling a legal matter this time, but simply as her father, said a few words over the two of them that had nothing to do with paper and everything to do with choices. Ruth cried through most of it, unapologetically. Jonah whooped loud enough that the horses startled in the barn, and got an elbow from Silas that did not stop him whooping again a moment later. And Silas himself, when it came time, clapped louder and longer than anyone standing in that yard, which surprised nobody who'd been paying attention since August, and surprised Silas least of all. Afterward, with the small crowd scattered, and the baby asleep against Ruth's shoulder, Henry found Grace at the edge of the newly planted field, looking out at the first thin lines of green just showing above the soil. He didn't say anything grand. He didn't need to by then. He just stood beside her and stayed. Every one of them was carrying something. The Reverend pushed his own daughter into a marriage with no love in it. But make no mistake, that was not an easy call. It cost him, and choosing Henry, a man he trusted to keep his word, when nobody was watching, wasn't easy either. That was a father handing over the one thing he couldn't afford to get wrong. Grace hadn't caused any of it. She carried the weight anyway, and then did more than carry it. She sat down at a table at 2 in the morning with a pen and a ledger, and saved the very farm she'd been brought into as a burden. And Henry said yes because he had to, not out of love. That land wasn't just acreage to him. It was his father's legacy. It was the roof over Ruth's head, and Silas's head, and Jonah's head, the people he'd sworn, without ever once saying it out loud, to look after. All three of them knew it. This was not the marriage anybody wanted. It was the least impossible option on the table, and somehow, that reluctant choice became the thing that saved every one of them. Most marriages start with the heart, some start with the head, and sometimes it's plain circumstance that puts two people on the same road, and only after walking it a while, through hail and a bad grade, and one long night in October, do they look over and realize the other one was the missing piece the whole time. To everyone watching, everyone still out there searching, and everyone who's already found that missing piece, I hope you get the life that comes after, the good kind. If this one stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me which of them you'd have trusted with that decision, the preacher or Henry. And if frontier stories told slow, honest, and true are the kind you come back for, subscribe and stay a while. There's a lot more waiting for you here on USA West Stories.